Welcome to COVID and Climate Change Correlations, a weekly video podcast where I, Daniel Sanderson, engage in a stimulating conversation with post-Keynesian economist Steve Keen. Okay, welcome everybody. I got Steve Keen back in the studio, Professor Steve Keen, and he's a post-Keynesian economist extraordinaire. Today I'm hoping to pick his brain a little bit about Nordhaus, his favorite his favorite economist, right? Mm-hmm. So before we just go into a free for all and a free fall on Nordhaus, what do you? I'm trying to wrap my head around these concepts of dice and rice, these regional frameworks for climate analysis. The thrust of your criticism, is it on the regional play? Is it really on regional, or is it on?
No, it's on the entire thing because what he does, and I'm pulling this apart with a group of fellow researchers for an article in a leading science journal right now. The entire thing is designed to say that capitalism can survive anything. Hit us with a meteor in less than 65 million years, we'll be back up there again, and it'll only be a minor impact on the economy. I wish I was being facetious. We just worked out that if you hit dice with damages that total 99.25% of GDP at some point in the overall trajectory, at the end of the simulation run, which is in 500 years, and dice it's very modest, it only tries to estimate the next half millennium, the GDP is about 10% lower. Okay, now there's a whole lot of reasons as why that happens, but it has just been throughout, partly intentionally, and that's in terms of how he's collected what he calls data that I call fantasies about the impact of climate change, empirical estimates. And then there's construction of the model itself. On the construction of the model itself, I mainly blame on neoclassical economics in general, but I reserve some special criticism for Nordhaus as well and how it used the mainstream standard.
Right. I was optimistically looking at some of his work, and there's one aspect of his work where he tried to do he tried to reimagine the GDP index. Are you familiar with that at all?
I've seen it. I mean, I mainly focus on what he's done in terms of climate change rather than any other attempts he's made to make economics more palatable.
Right. Okay. So let's stay there then. So back in 2020, his model was reworked by the Potsdam Institute, and it doesn't appear to me in any sort of surface investigation that the Potsdam Institute found any major flaws. But I could be mistaken. Was there anything that you saw in your research?
No, I haven't looked at that particular study. I've spoken to people at the Potsdam Institute. They know my opinion of Nordhaus overall. Clearly, I'm more critical than they are.
There seemed to be a reworking of it to align with the Paris Agreement. And so that was more towards that 2 degrees, which Nordhaus seems to be going in the opposite direction anyways, that 2 degrees isn't possible. But neither here nor there, I don't think that's something that you're focusing on, right?
Well, I mean, what I'm focusing on, that he actually argues 4 degrees is optimal. And 6 degrees would only cause GDP to fall by 8.5% compared to what it would be in the complete absence of climate change. Now, I think that's delusional, dangerous, negligent in terms of the negligence of the existence of life on Earth, frankly. It is nothing tiny about this, because when you look at what scientists say that what would happen with the 6 degree Celsius, which is roughly about 10 degrees Fahrenheit, increase in the average temperature of the planet, fundamentally they're saying that would be an extinction event on the scale of the meteor that hit the dinosaurs. We're not talking 8.5% of GDP loss. We're talking, if we're lucky, 8.5% of GDP left. And I think that'd be an overestimate. So it's mainly utterly trivializing the dangers of climate change.
I got to pause and put my hand up and say that, I mean, we've talked about austerity before and say, from a GDP standpoint, we're so hyperly inflated with our product production, right? Our gross domestic product as a measurement of some sort of like quote unquote homeostasis, right? Equilibrium. And I know you don't like that, but I'm leaning more towards this concept of equilibrium, or setting down to something that's more like austerity. Austerity is the word, Steve. I mean, why are we still talking about gross domestic product when we need to be, like I think you said, an order of magnitude less? That's
austerity was like the actual austerity we've had practiced on us was driven by the belief that neoclassicals had that any spending you do now involves a debt you've got to repay in the future. And in an accounting sense, that's dead wrong. Their accounting is naive. And the most recent paper I've written is a joke. I mean, frankly, when I look at how they reason about the financial impact of austerity in a model in which money doesn't exist. And therefore what we're doing, we're borrowing, as one of my good friend Michael Kumhoff puts it, we're borrowing gravel from each other. And so when a bank lends out gravel, when you deposit gravel, you've got less gravel to use, so you can do less building with the gravel, blah, blah, blah. That's nothing to do with how money functions. So the austerity had imposed upon us has been a false austerity. However, when you look at where we've got to, at the same time encouraged by exactly the same economists about what to do about GDP, and therefore the amount of physical stuff we pull out of the ground and turn into objects like this for us to use in capital, in human society. They've said go for broke, absolutely go bonkers, and we are therefore and really under their advice, we are consuming 3 to 5 times as much of the planet as we were doing back in 1972, when the limits to growth first came out and said unless we constrain our consumption and the genuine sort of austerity you're talking about, we're going to face a breakdown of the economic and ecological system. And, that's what we are facing, frankly, courtesy of ignoring the advice of the limits to growth, courtesy, again, of neoclassical economists, courtesy in particular of William Nordhaus. We have to impose a real austerity to be able to bring humanity's pressure on the environment back to a level where we don't end up disrupting the environment and undermining our own capacity to survive on this planet.
Yeah, and this is all on the heels of news where we have our billionaires racing to get into some sort of circular orbits in a space program. And I don't know, are you in the same boat that I am, just kind of shaking my head at that ridiculousness?
Well, I'm shaking my head at Bezos and Virgin, because Branson's trip, it's a junket. Only wealthier people can afford to hop on that rocket and go up and enjoy 4 minutes of weightness before they slide back down again. Bezos' entire episode was about apparently 10 minutes from go to Earth. I didn't bother watching. I did watch a video replay of the landing of the rocket because I think that's an important element. We have more than one company that produces a rocket which can land back, on ground rather than having to burn up in the atmosphere on the way back in. So that's a reasonable advance. And I also agree with Bezos that we have to take production off planet. So his objective, I agree with. Branson is just tourism. So I find those two events quite laughable. And the fact that they bloody well rocketed themselves up into space, I see Musk criticised all the time on social media. He hasn't tried to make himself, and he could easily have done it, one of the astronauts to fly to the ISS, even flying around the moon. He's keeping his ego out of it. Well, what I see with Branson and Bezos is just ego personified.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay, it pulls me in another direction because I just see these. So we're a little bit different. It's like from a Bezos standpoint, production off planet. I mean, really, is it that attainable? Is it a possibility?
Yes, it is attainable. I mean, not now, obviously, but like in the same sense, if you and I are having this conversation in 1900, is it really feasible to fly from one continent to another?
Right.
Yes. Okay. But in terms of, I mean, the great drawback of production on the planet is we have to dump the waste into the environment.
Yeah.
And that waste, first of all, that constrains how much energy we can actually use. This is where the laws of thermodynamics come in. So you can only exploit the temperature difference as your source of power to power a machine. And that temperature difference stops at about 300 Kelvin, which is roughly the background temperature of the planet. So if you have a chemical process that generates heat at 600 Kelvin, you only got 300 Kelvin to exploit on the planet. You take that into outer space, your background is 2.5, 3 degrees, 3 Kelvin. So you've got that much more energy that you can actually exploit out of any process you put in train up there. We know that the asteroid belt between Earth and Mars basically is the remnants of a planet fairly, in its own way, like the inner rocky planets. There are meteors. Have you ever been to the Museum of Natural Sciences in New York?
No.
Okay. One of my favorite exhibits there is a meteor that they located, courtesy, I think, of what Inuit tribes were reporting, having all these incredible knives they were making, nickel iron knives. And this was a nickel iron meteorite, which I think is about no more than 2 meters across, but it weighs so much they had to put in extra foundations in the building to support it. Now, okay. It's the same as the core of the planet of the Earth, which is thousands of kilometers of solid nickel iron, and fragments of that are floating around in the asteroid belt. And those fragments would provide humanity with enough construction materials, iron and nickel, obviously, but also many other elements for thousands of years. So if you actually were making that goods off planet and then dropping them onto the planet, and again, that's if you imagine, balloons to bring the stuff down, which is quite feasible technologically, you could actually have the literal manna from heaven routine. What the Pacific Islanders used to call the cargo cult would become the nature of humanity on this planet. And you would have consumption on the planet, but not production. And even there, you'd have to say, okay, the consumption can only be so much of an energy usage, because ultimately that consumption becomes waste, both energy and material terms. So it's no panacea overall, but it would force us to treat the planet as something where we have to maintain its survivability for life as it's evolved when we evolved, which is when carbon dioxide was about between 200 and 300 parts per million, not the 400 plus parts we've got it to now.
Wow. Do you have any mates that you talk about this stuff with? This is fascinating. I had no idea. About that.
Actually, I watched quite a fascinating video just a couple of days ago, because when I get bored and finish working, I watch YouTube, and it's either rock and roll, SpaceX material, or some technological stuff that I'll take a look at. And there was an interview with the guy who's responsible for the design effort to design the Mars bases for SpaceX, and it's quite a remarkable interview. I'll find the link for it when you start raving at some point. I'll go searching on YouTube. It'll be over here somewhere. But what the guy argued, he was actually asked what sort of society would be sustainable on Mars, and the answer was it has to be egalitarian. Because if you allow the wealth extreme that exists in the Earth to develop in Mars, the society will break down. And in a sense, have you ever read a book by the brilliant science fiction writer Ursula Le Guin called The Dispossessed?
No, not really a big science fiction guy, but...
Well, get a copy of The Dispossessed. I think it's one of the most brilliant books ever written.
Okay.
And what she makes up a fantasy planet with Earthlings, Earth-like creatures being on it, of course. And there's a planet called Uras, which I think is a great name for an arsehole of a planet. Eurus, circled by a moon called Anares. And Anares has just enough gravity to maintain an atmosphere. So it's obviously like a moon the size of Earth in that sense, but very, very barren. And there's a political conflict between anarchists on Eurus and the capitalist nation on Eurus. And they basically fight the capitalists to a standstill, and the deal is finally made. You can have Anares so long as you send back a product which is unique on Anares that is needed by Eurus for its industry, which they agree to do. And what you have established on Anares is an anarchist society, where the emphasis is on sharing rather than accumulation. Now, it's got its own drawbacks, and that's what I really admire about Le Guin, is that the anarchist society had drawbacks that drove its leading scientists to go from Anares to Eurus, and then there's all the social and political. But what was implied, and this actually came out in this study of how could you maintain a civilization on Mars, they realized that for a start, you've got to be underground. Okay? Have you ever seen the movie? You've obviously, we wouldn't have the Schwarzenegger movie. I think it's not called The Red Planet, but it's something about civilization on Mars. Total Recall.
Yeah.
That was what in Total Recall, people are living in a valley where there's a very deep valley and all the accommodation is on the walls of the valley. That's precisely what the SpaceX community has decided is the only feasible way to go about it. And then to build the pods, so of course, you know, there's no way you can build a Mara logo, you know, or as I prefer to call it, more a logo. You can't build one of those up there to be, you know, ridiculous scale. So everybody gets these same roughly 500 cubic Meteorite. I'm not really sure of the dimensions again. Living spot, you get exactly the same space per person. And then if you want to have a relationship, well, you know, the person moves in next door to you, and you then double the space. The space actually works out being comparable to New York. The density, they say, will be similar to New York and that. But the fundamental thing is you cannot get the levels of income and wealth disparity that apply on the Earth because for a start, you can't store the stuff. Okay. And secondly, you can't use that amount of energy without jeopardizing the survivability of the rest of the culture. So fundamentally, that would have to be an egalitarian society. Now, what you want to try to do is to maintain a society which is egalitarian and still allows a level of innovation that capitalism distinguishes itself from previous social systems. So it would mean a whole new social structure, and bring it back to the idea of, you know, Basil's idea of production off planet and then dropping the goods on planet equally. People on the planet, your income, and this is the crazy thing, there's no way your income on this planet could be based on the income model of Amazon.
Yeah. That's fascinating. I think it's really interesting that our economic models are so determined by our planet, right? I haven't really thought of it that way, right? I mean, we have a lot of thought goes into theory, economic theory, and it seems that the underpinning of that theory is very ideological, and yet, and yet here we are. We've got this like compelling case, you know, in comparison, you know, from out of the books of science fiction that make it very concrete. It's like reifying in front of us that there's just a limit. There's just like a limit in physics that there's just no way to have that kind of scale.
Yeah. I'm actually going to quickly, that video I mentioned, I'll just bring up on the chat window so I can paste it here. That's the link to the video.
Okay.
So have a look at it. It's worth watching the whole thing. I mean, I very rarely, because I just don't have time, I watch videos at double speed to have any chance of, you know, doing what I want to do and learning from anybody else at the same time. But that makes the point. You can't have this society functioning unless it's egalitarian. You might like, you might say, like, allow a 1 to 10 or maybe even a 1 to 100 range in incomes, but no more than that. It's simply not possible. Okay?
Wow,
so
that's really interesting, yeah.
Whereas what William Baumol called the cowboy economy we live inside right now, where basically open slather, do what you damn well like, you can get, wealth inequality, which are of the order of 1 million to 1. If you actually, in fact, more than that, if you look at the poorest person on the planet to the richest, your scale is of the order of 1 billion to 1 in terms of income levels, maybe even worse. And that is only possible because we are treating this like a cornucopia that goes on forever. Now, if you start with a planet where the struggle is to make sure everybody can survive and that you can have reproduction and maintenance of population over time, then you cannot allow those income disparities to apply.
Yeah, very, very nicely said. What are your thoughts about limits to population? That's been a contentious thing politically with China and the growth of explosion. I think I hear some information from scientists that we're headed towards a natural flattening of the trend for population growth.
We are, and like that, when you start getting the wealth levels, income levels that people enjoy in North America and Northern Europe, then there tends to be a natural decision to have less children. I mean, when I worked in overseas aid for a number of years before I became an academic, and one of the explanations that I got as to why people have so many children is that's effectively your social welfare. Not only is it a lack of access to birth control, it's also that the state gives you nothing for your future. So the way to ensure you have a future is to have a lot of kids, and then the family unit. If I'm living in Asia now, I can see how much more central the family unit is to life here than it is in Europe. And so the family unit provides you with that welfare, and therefore, a lot of kids make sense. Once you remove that, if the society itself provides the welfare, so you don't have to worry about whether you'll have enough income, whether you'll have enough money coming in when you can't earn an income anymore. If the state provides that, if society collectively provides it, then there's less pressure to have lots and lots of children. But at the same time, I see when I know from friends of mine having kids, there's such a desire to have 2 or 3. Now, 2 or 3 on average gets you more than maintenance of population. So you would have to have a system that said, okay, the average has to be no higher than, I think, 2.1 or 2.2, and then you could maintain the population. And again, in terms of the Mars base, what they're talking about is a population, I think, spread across 3 cities of about 1 million people initially. And the cities are located so that the resources that are necessary in one city can be provided by another. But when you get to that level and you say, well, actually the maximum we can support is X, and therefore that, your share of X determines how many children you can have. So the same thing should apply on Earth, because looking at us as a species, we are using, this is where the human ecological footprint is a very nice calculation, even if you ignore their way of mapping carbon dioxide generation into our load on the planet, you come up with that humans are currently using 80% of the renewable capacity of the planet. When you include carbon dioxide, you get 160%. So it's why we're destroying the sustainability of the planet. But we have to be far below that, I think, as a species to enable room for life. We have to treat life with the reverence it deserves. And that would mean restricting ourselves to something of the order of 20%, maximum 50% of the sustainable resources of the planet. That means a one-third cut in our consumption, a 2/3 cut in our consumption at the minimum. And that obviously means far less income disparities, which is where I'd start, but also far less population. So I think, I've seen some of the permaculture crowd I know talk about being able to sustain 10 billion people on the planet. We don't need, screw it, okay? I think 1 billion is plenty of humans, and then let's leave some room for some elephants and wildebeest and crickets as well, and ants for that matter. Larry Summers. And we have to because we are the peak predator on the planet and because we are an omnivore, we have to restrain ourselves, otherwise we destroy the whole damn thing.
That's a very good summary, right? I mean, very sensible. I've been playing with this idea of a military action. I think you're on board with a military-like response, to the climate crisis. Now, the way I envision this military response is primarily around supply chain, hospitals, this type of thing. And I personally would bring back conscription for young folks, young kids coming out of high school. Countries do it now. I just think that would be a worthwhile effort. And so the war is not against other nations; it's against the climate, and also providing infrastructure, just like any war.
Let's actually make that war for the climate rather than against it. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. For a livable climate. And so I thought of a simple heuristic that you've got mandatory military conscription until the age of, say, 25 or 28, right? Now, from that point on, if you decide to have children, you'd have to be involved in that service longer, right? I mean, and in a way, this happens anyways, right? If as a couple, if we decide to get married and have children, we have this responsibility for 20 years, right? At least, well, our entire lifetime. But we have this responsibility that bears down on us that I think I'd like to see that in that military structure, right? So if a couple says, you know what, we're not going to have children. Okay, well, the incentive, because I'm big about incentive, your incentive means that you can, you could be a poet or retire, so to speak, at 25, 26, 27, 28, whenever that time period is, right? And I don't know, I just think that there's a better way to live in a civilized society. And I can't say that that's possible for every, country on the planet. And I guess maybe it begs the question to say, if we can't do it for every country on the planet, is it worth doing at all? I don't know. It's
well, I mean,
hard sell.
My main thing is to maintain human knowledge. The amount we've learned in the last 2 centuries is stunning, and a large part of being powered by fossil fuels. Without the fossil fuels, we would never have invented the machines that are a large part of how we've learned about the nature of life and the universe in general. And to think we could destroy it all by just excess is, to me, a terrifyingly stupid thing to do. So we've been, and this comes back to Nordhaus again, which we better get back to talking about.
Yeah.
That particular myth in neoclassical economics is encourage us to destroy the sustainability of this planet, because their base way of thinking about the economy treats the ecology as an externality which will always be there in its current state, in the state which enabled us to evolve as a species. And that is fundamentally wrong, and we're wearing it right now. And this year, is throwing some pretty extreme examples of what the climate is likely to be in the future, and just how sustainable human society is in that climate. And the answer is not at all. And you can actually blame it on neoclassical economics, because without their encouragement to ignore and trivialize the climate, we would have been doing something about this 50 years ago. Yeah.
Now, I do think that have you heard of the Heritage Foundation at all?
Yeah. One of the American so-called think tanks. Yeah.
Okay.
I think they're better. I bet actually it's called them wank tanks.
Okay, all right, but they're on the same side because they're very critical about the about
the breakthrough. You mean the one in Melbourne? Oh, that's very different. Yeah. No, that's started by some colleagues of mine actually. I'm thinking of Heritage Foundation or Breakthrough. Did you say
the Heritage Foundation?
I'm not so sure about that one. Show me what you've got. I'll take a look at them.
Okay, but they have I think it's the Heritage Foundation is a conservative think tank in the United States called the DICE model, flawed beyond use for policymaking. on account of his extreme sensitivity to initial assumptions.
Well, I don't think I disagree with him on that. It's not at all sensitive to initial assumptions. Well, what are they? You'd need to give me that particular link. But
yeah, we'll spend some time on it, maybe on next episode. But a little preview from next episode. We got a special guest coming in. He's just somebody that's read your book and it'll be a little bit of a Q&A. So I think we'll change it up with a Q&A on your book. And so we're going to prepare some questions, and I might send them to you in advance just to give you a bit of a heads up. You're always great on your feet, though, Steve. You can just kind of roll with it. But why not?
Sure. Yeah.
We've got those in advance. So back to Nordhaus. Have you heard about his his time at Yale and this skull and crossbones secret society that he?
I've heard a bit about. I mean, American universities are pretty weird locations, from what I can see. And these fraternities you guys have, which are not at all. They're not at a. They exist to some extent in English universities, but the frat house and the fraternity stuff is very much the American product. I do tell.
Well, it's the skull and bones is this model about this exclusive secret society that's part of Yale, and it's I guess it's known for being predominantly white, male, Protestant, the kind of drill, right? But the Bush senior and junior were part of it, and this kind of thing. So it kind of leads to this. It may lead some people to think about conspiracy with oil and all this kind of thing. Is Nordhaus at all associated with any kind of oil? Would you say?
I think that people get this the wrong way around. They think economists are paid to say what they say. No, what happens is economists who say what a vested interest get paid by the vested interest to continue saying it, but they'd say it regardless. So this is where people like Nordhaus turn up, because they actually believe that capitalism can cope with anything, and therefore, if you want to have if you're a lobby group with vested interest in reducing regulation or letting you to go hammer and tongs at drilling in environmentally sensitive areas and so on, those are the economists you're going to provide money to. And so characters like me get zilch funding from that lot. People like Nordhaus, we get quite a comfortable funding, thanks very much, but they're saying what they'd say anyway. And what goes on, they get more money to say it, and they get a bigger platform on which to say it.
Yeah. Well, this is for anybody tuning in. This is all fairly common knowledge on Wikipedia, but just like anything you read on Wikipedia, you got to do a lot more digging. And one thing I noticed, Steve, is that I think we got to do something to get more prominent on the Wikipedia page. You show up on the dice page, the dice and rice page, but nothing necessarily under Nordhaus, which I think is kind of scratching my head on how to do that. I haven't.
Oh well, I've actually seen that. I think I am referenced in Nordhaus's page now.
Oh, okay.
That's likely to become a lot more obvious when the paper I'm working on, which we hope to submit in the next 2 weeks or so to the leading science journal. When that turns up, I think we're going to hear. Oh no, you're right. I'm not actually I don't turn up on Nordhaus's own page, but I would turn up. I think I turn up in Dice. So I think I actually was. Critics focus on several aspects. I've got a feeling. Yeah, that's probably. I think I was there, and that's been edited out. I would say. I'd guess if you look in the talk, most likely somebody has deleted that section of me. I just actually search there and find out. Let's see. No, it wasn't even in the talk section. Okay.
Well, we'll have to do something about that, right? I mean, that's the whole premise of Wikipedia, is that it should be someone like me goes in and puts. It's just I don't have a lot of experience about putting Wikipedia information in. So, I mean, I might give it an attempt and throw it your way to see if, as long as I'm wording things correctly or whatever. But I think it needs to be done, right? I mean, Wikipedia is such a force that you type Steve Keen into the Google Oracle, and the Wikipedia page has always got one. It's always on the first page, right? So
yeah. I mean, we need to get critique of Nordhaus more widely known, which is why I'm writing this paper for Science Journal right now, because it's really cited to have to know how bad economics is. Because, and I know from speaking to plenty of scientists over the years, they automatically think if economics lives to the same standards that sciences do. Now, if economics lived to the same standard that sciences do, neoclassical economics would not exist. It would have ceased sometime in the 1930s at the latest, because of all the intellectual and empirical flaws that had accumulated by then. The fact that it's still with us in 2020 is a sign of how unscientific economics really is.
Yeah. Okay. I think, like, heading into the last 20 minutes of our talk, I'd like to spend time on the currency, the global currency, the carbon currency. I'd like you to spend some time explaining that again. It's such an important piece.
Yeah, well, actually, David Williams picked up when I was talking with him on a podcast earlier this week as well. The basic idea is that we have drastically exceeded the amount of carbon dioxide we should put into the atmosphere. I think people are beginning to realize that this year with the crazy weather you're seeing in America and Europe. You can't maintain a human civilization when you're likely to get a flood, as we saw actually in China just a couple of 1 or 2 days ago, if that, where 10 inches of rain falls in 1 hour and therefore just wipes out the subway. And people, did you see those photographs? People actually stuck in subway carriages with water up to their chests. Okay, well, there goes your infrastructure. Okay, gone in 1 day. I'm sure that China would rebuild pretty rapidly, but nonetheless, that's not a sustainable way to have a city. So with that, I've lost my train of thought.
No, that's actually ironic. That was in a subway, right? That did that to you.
Okay. Now, so that's not a world we can survive in. So, but we've got there because economists have downplayed the dangers for all this time. So, and scientists, when they see what economists actually do, pull their hair. In fact, I'm going to quote one of my own patrons here, because it was just quite. The universal carbon credit I'll come back to, but he was talking about, he couldn't believe what he read of a economist, John Cochrane, diving in on climate change and the physical ignorance and the triviality of the assumptions they'll make that the economists think are scientific. When scientists see it, they go, "You've got to be crazy." The universal carbon credit. This is realizing we've gone far past sustainability. We have to go backwards. But to go backwards, there's no way we can reduce the consumption level of the poor. Okay? In any society, the poor, the people at the bottom end of the social spectrum cannot go lower. They're already, surviving day to day. Okay. If you cut their consumption levels, they will die. And before they die, they will revolt as best they can. So you have to impose the burden on the rich. And my proposal is to use central bank digital currencies as a rationing system, so that everybody gets an account at the central bank, every adult. Every adult would initially receive a universal carbon credit, which could be given out on a daily basis. It's electronic. We don't have to do it every year. It can be done every day. A universal carbon credit. That universal carbon credit could be equal to the average carbon consumption for that country. But because the wealth and income distribution is so badly skewed, 90 to 95% of people would be consuming less than the average. So whereas the 5%, maybe 10, but more likely 5% and above of the population would be consuming more than the average. So their carbon credit would not be enough to sustain their current consumption. But when you're in shopping, you would pay a money price and a universal carbon credit price out of the two accounts, your bank account or your cash, whatever, and then your UCC account at the central bank. And then because as one of the 90%, let's say, you would have excess carbon credits you're not actually capable of using with the amount of money you've got, you could sell those on a market, obviously, to the rich who would need it because they've got the money, but they haven't got the carbon credit. But that would be a way of the universal carbon credit would be priced by a market system and would then transfer wealth and money from the rich to the poor. So the idea is you'd have something which would not, when you first put it in, at least 90% of the population would be benefiting from it. And the idea there to get something which people would be in favour of rather than opposed to out of self-interest. And then once it's in place, if we find we're actually in catastrophic levels, and I think this decade is going to see potentially catastrophic climate changes, and people thought, holy shit, we've really got to take this much more seriously. You could drop the average and use that as a rationing system for that war we're talking about, where a war to repair the climate.
Yeah, very good. I think that's really brilliant, and it ties incentive. It removes wealth from the extreme wealthy in such a way as it's not revolting with pitchforks and violence, right? Because this is, we're not seizing assets, we're not appropriating, materials or taking from the wealthy. And it's still a matter of choice. So I think that's a nice balance, Steve.
Yeah, it's a good concept. I mean, somebody else, when I first published the idea, I found that another intellectual, basically concerned citizen, really, had already started this. It's looking for his name here, Adam Hardy. And Adam got in touch. His website is called carbonwatchdog.org. So that's got more detail on the actual proposal than I provided.
Yeah, I was actually there was somebody from another carbon website as a special guest. I'm trying to arrange to come on the show, and he's familiar with your work, so we'll stay tuned for that. So I guess the thing that I have, or the question about the carbon, say carbon currency, right? This global carbon currency. Is it going to have any aspect to, like, however ironic this may sound, the like a decentralized currency like a crypto, or is it nothing to do with that?
Pretty much nothing to do with it.
Okay.
I think cryptocurrency is going to be shut down because, I mean, if the energy consumption levels of Bitcoin have now told are pretty close to the energy consumption levels of Argentina, one very fast way to reduce our load on the planet is to abolish Bitcoin. Now, at some point when we realize, holy shit, we are about to destroy human civilization, unless we drastically reduce the amount of carbon dioxide and we're pumping into the atmosphere and the amount of energy we're using in general, then goodbye Bitcoin. Okay, this will be a fiat currency, but it would be a fiat currency using some of the electronic concepts that have come through. So things like the blockchain as a way of, I mean, a blockchain is what I say, a sophisticated linked list. In computing terms, so it's not all that amazing. It's a sort of combination of a hash table and a linked list. So you would use that, and you'd be basing it mainly on database technology rather than Bitcoin specifically. But yeah, the electronic side would have elements of what's come out through the cryptocurrencies, but only because cryptocurrencies themselves have been built on previous elements of computing.
Yeah, so I never did see the upside to be an early adopter into the rush to cryptocurrency.
Well, you make I'm sorry, I didn't take Max and Stacey's advice and buy a couple of £1,000 worth of Bitcoin when they were about $10 each. I'd be able to finance what I'm doing now. Got out of the speculation. I could have sold it out at 20,000 would have done me fine at 200 times return on the money.
Yeah,
I would have sold out then. I'm sorry I didn't in one sense, but in the other sense, I've never actually indulged in speculation. So it's maintained my track record.
Well, that's the thing. Like, for every speculation, hindsight proves to be, clairvoyant. It just, how many times do you lose on those speculative?
Well, that's what brought Newton undone. I mean, Newton had exactly the same attitude to the South Sea bubble. He thought it was a speculative thing, which was total waste of time, wasn't real, couldn't possibly work. And then at some point, he'd missed out on so much. He thought, oh, bugger it, I might as well throw a few, and he lost the lot. So the timing is what matters. And obviously, back when it was $10, I could have afforded to lose £1,000, no problem at all. if I buy one Bitcoin now, 30,000. Sorry, I'm building a house.
Yeah, you're kidding,
so
yeah.
you know, in that sense, yes, I made a mistake not to dive in and take Max and Stacey's advice at the time, because the loss would have been trivial. Now, if people dive in and they buy it, even though you can buy a tiny fraction of a Bitcoin, you know, it's a wild west in terms of how it's not regulated, and we're seeing plenty of people losing their shirts courtesy of it, making some money as well in the meantime. But to my way of thinking, it's never going to take over the monetary system, and the way it's designed in the first instance, it doesn't support transactions. So you know, it could never become money without losing what gives it appeal to other people, which is rate of appreciation over time.
Oh, really? So that's the main draw right now is the rate of appreciation. Yeah, I did meet somebody recently that was involved with the same sort of thing, but to raise capital for companies, right? And so to attract large pools of investors, and you know, that's interesting. But yeah, I think maybe it has a limited shelf life. I never really understood what the reason why to, you know, I seem to think that our currency systems seem to function pretty good, right?
Well, right. Bitcoin was a solution to a problem that didn't exist. I mean, the whole thing was you can't trust the bank's ledgers. Well, fundamentally, most of the time you can. Mm-hmm. I know one instance where the Commonwealth Bank of Australia lost a truckload of tapes at some stage, and meant that they don't have records going back more than 12 years from when it happened, which is about 2 or 3 years ago. And that looks a bit suspicious. But generally speaking, it's not the trustworthy of the ledgers, it's what they create money to do that's been the problem. If they were creating money to finance entrepreneurs and corporations and large consumer purchases, then there'd be no problem with the financial system. It's because they finance Ponzi schemes. That's the real problem. And their accounting of the Ponzi schemes was perfect until the schemes collapsed. So it's not the accounting side that's weak. It's the how the power to create money was used that's the problem. And in that sense, I'm sorry, I don't see Bitcoin as being any better.
Yeah, that's right. And this will be a good way to kind of wrap up this week's episode is, you know, the elaboration on the Ponzi scheme, because I think there's an aspect of you bringing up the concept of Ponzi scheme, which has to do with not the valuation of money, but the value of money and the relationship of money with personal debt. And you've talked about that before. So that's really what you were referring to in that shade of Ponzi scheme. Is that not correct?
That's true. We'll have to talk about Nordhaus in more detail on another time. We got massively distracted there. Well,
you know, here's the thing about our talks is that, you know, any of these particular episodes, we like to jump in and, you know, because, you know, there's always something to talk about. And what I'm trying to give everybody is a little bit of a taste of, you know, what's going on in the world of Steve Keen. And so you're a multi-dimensional man, right?
So my waistline as well. Yeah.
Oh, good. But I mean, look, we pulled you into science fiction and all sorts of stuff. So we're very lucky to have you, Steve. And, you know, I think that pretty much wraps up, you know, this week, unless you have any, you know, special announcements, you know, that you want to share with us?
That'll do me. Maybe one of those coming out in a few weeks' time, but that'll do for this show.
And the paper, it's going well? Countdown there?
Well, we're very, very close to finishing it now. And it's dramatically better than I could have written on my own. So it's one of the, I mean, it's been difficult managing a collaboration with 5 other academics as well at the same time. And I must admit, I'm using a text system called Overleaf to do the editing, and it's a pain in the ass, in my opinion. I'm actually becoming back, as much as I hate Word, I prefer Word to working with Overleaf. But yeah, the quality of what we're going to put together is going to be a bit of a shock in the system for economists, and they damn well deserve it.
Well, good for you, and you deserve it as well. So it's really great to see it come together, and moderately stressful. So it's good to hear.
Okay.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it. Till next week.
Bye.
Bye.